Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Sunday Sit Down. I'm Reverend Phil Dieke, one of the pastors on staff here at White Rock United Methodist Church. Thanks for joining me for this Sit Down today. This is the wrap-up week of our series, Love Local. We've spent the last 5. This is our 6th week in this series, which is a long time for us to do a series. We don't usually do series this long, but really grateful for the opportunity to have the conversations we've had. We started off with the bishop being with us, and we've had great conversations with Krista White and the chaplains at Parkland, and we had Elizabeth Mosley last week talking about study, and this week I'm really excited. I really thought long and hard, how do I land the plane on this series? It's been a really great series, and we just had a lot of really great conversations, and I'm not always really good with discernment, but I thought through it a whole lot, and I landed with I'm going to call him a friend, I'm going to call him a colleague. Really what he does is he is the leader of a cohort that I'm a part of through Texas Methodist Foundation, and he is joining us today from Washington, D.C. So we have, is it Reverend William H. Lamar IV, or Pastor, or what do you go by?
Just call me Bill, Phil. Bill.
Just call me Bill.
Yeah, Bill and Phil, it rhymes.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so I've had a chance. We've only actually met once on our cohort that we're a part of, but we've had a couple phone conversations as well, and it's always great to be able to share in conversation with Bill. He's a true gem. You are the pastor at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal in Washington D.C. Now, I did a little bit of research on this church just because I didn't know a whole lot about it. It's got quite the history to it.
An incredible history. What I share, Phil, often, when I was appointed to the church, the bishop who appointed me and the 2 presiding elders, what UMC folk would call district superintendents, all 3 of them had pastored the church prior to me, beginning in 1986. I got the appointment in 2007.
Okay.
So the bishop asked me once I was assigned, how do you feel? And I said, I feel like you've strapped 200 years of history on my back. And he said, that's exactly what I've done. So the church has a tremendous history, and we're living into the ancestral kind of mandate of serving in the nation's capital in a way that lifts up the liberating love of Christ in the community.
Yeah, I saw people like Frederick Douglass, and there's some big names that have been associated with this congregation.
So it was tremendous for me as a young kid. I consumed history like other children, other young boys, especially consumed sports. And almost everyone that I read about in the books that kept me company, Frederick Douglass attended. He was not a member. His funeral was there. W.E.B. Du Bois, Rosa Parks's Washington, D.C. funeral was there. Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Mary McLeod Bethune. The list goes on and on and on. And because we're in the vicinity of the White House, some of those political leaders came. But to me, they're nowhere near as important as the other folks who had come through the church.
Well, I love you said that, because it's easy to look back at the history and you have these big, incredible names that have been a part of it, but at the same time, there's still a congregation that worships there now, right? And
yes,
you're the pastor that carries 200 years of incredible history, but you're the pastor to people that are there and present now in DC. And I saw on the website, it says worship, liberation, and service.
Yes, and those are the things that anchor us. Worship to me and to us speaks to being called to participate in the divine life. God calling us into relationship with the divine. And when that worship takes place, when you read Exodus, God says to Moses, free my people so they may worship me. Then once you worship God, God leads you toward liberation, spiritually, politically, economically, and people who have been liberated from whatever bondages they may have suffered under. Those liberated people are called to liberate others. So we're drawn into the life of God, into the mysterious and beautiful life of God. We are liberated there so that we can liberate others. And once we are free, we can serve one another, and especially serve alongside God as co-creators of new heaven and new earth. And we also talk about embracing God's beloved community. Yeah. So no matter what human being finds her way, his way to our doors, we're called to embrace them, to love them, and invite them into the journey of worship, liberation, and service.
I love all of that. You know, you paint a beautiful journey in the process of those three. I'm gonna call them simple words, right? They're not simple words by any means, but worship, liberation, and service. But it really tells an incredible story just in those three words. I mentioned to you we're finishing this series that's really our discipleship kind of plan, or it's not really a path. It's more kind of a way of being and the way that we exist in this world. And we are disciples. We feel this kind of holistic call, and the four words we kind of run with are live. What does it mean to live with one another and among one another? And obviously that's being challenged now, where less is in physical presence with one another, and how do we live together in virtual spaces as well as trying to be in physical. But so it live, and it's worship, like you said too, and then it's service, and then it's study as well, kind of the four quadrants or four pillars of our kind of discipleship. The other thing I saw, and this ties into what we're looking at today, and our theme for worship today is you quoted by saying it's love, not fear, that will get us through. Right. That's on your website and the letter that you wrote to your congregation in the midst of this. So I would love to hear your idea behind it's love, not fear, that will get us through, especially given all that's going on in the world with the pandemic, but also that we know there's more than just a virus pandemic happening. There's a pandemic of racism, and there's a whole lot of things happening in the world. So what inspired you to make that statement?
You know, Phil, I immediately go back to a book. It's probably 20 years old now. It's called The End of Words. It's Richard Lisher's Lyman Beecher lectures. And the title is double entendre. End as in all things are over, kaput, done, but also end as in purpose, telos. So his argument there is that in our world, where we have to preach and teach and proclaim the gospel in many different ways, words have been so cheapened and devalued as to make preaching very difficult, teaching very difficult, unless we return to the source of why we do what we do. So I give that background. I talk then about the word love. The English language is a very poor language when it comes to trying to describe love. Because I could tell you I love my wife, I love my family, but I can also tell you I love Jiffy Pop popcorn and I love candy and chocolate. Totally. It's a huge interpretive and descriptive chasm between loving and being loyal to human beings and loving food that I eat. And so when you read the Christian Testament, the Christian scriptures, there are many more words for love than we have. So you have in the Greek, you got Philios, Philadelphia, the brotherly love, sisterly love. Eros, the sexual love that, although we don't like to think about it, we would not be here were it not for some eros between our parents, right? And finally, agape, which to me is such a profound thinking around love. And this is the way that my professor taught us to understand agape. It is love whereby the lover loves the beloved, whether or not that loved is returned. The lover loves the beloved, regardless whether or not the love is returned. And this is a divine love. And agape is a gift that is internal to the character and being of God, that God can extend to us when we enter that mysterious life with God that I call worship. You might call prayer, meditation. And so to me, love is very important because I want, especially that God kind of love, which is necessary for the kind of community that human beings can create. And so when I say that love will get us through, I don't mean that very cheapened emotional feeling that we attach to people or things. I mean a deep love that resonates, that sacrifices. I'll say this and then I'll stop. Another description of that kind of love is that it is self-giving and other affirming. That kind of love, that agape kind of love, is self-giving and other affirming. And the way that theologians talk about it is that is the love internal to the Trinitarian reality of God. And so one of the words that you learn in study around the Trinity is perichoresis. Just a fancy way of saying the word choreography has a similar root, that God, the triune God, exists in a perpetual loving dance. And we too are called to exist in that dance. The problem is, in our world, particularly in the imperial United States, there are people who have been intentionally left out of the dance. There are people whose bodies have been used to fuel the dance of others, but they have never been considered fully human participants. So the way that we were taught is God exists in that kind of community. We too are called to exist in that kind of community, but we have built in this nation, many have built an exclusive dance. And a lot of the tremors that we are feeling politically and otherwise, because people who have been excluded are demanding as human beings to be included in the dance. And we've got to work through that.
Yeah, let's stay there for a second, because I think this is where it's challenging to understand what love really means, right? And we're looking at, 1 Corinthians 13 is a text we're going to work through in worship today. And, it's called the love chapter, and often it's read at weddings, and, that's great and lovely and all, but that's a really challenging love, right? When you talk about this Trinitarian understanding of love and this dance that we're invited to be a part in, but then also recognize that some get to dance because others don't, or others are allowing them that dance or creating the opportunity for that. Like, the question then for me becomes, how do the ones who are excluded embrace and embody that agape love, and I think this is a really great question for you that resonates specifically with your community and what you're dealing with right now. And I'll let you, kind of lead in and speak to that a little bit too.
So it's interesting. That chapter, Paul is trying to resolve a conflict in the church, right? So some people are saying, my gifts are greater than yours. You can do this, blah, 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 blah. Very human reality. Paul gets toward that chapter and he says, essentially, there is an order of the gifts. Now abide faith, hope, charity, in the King James, love, agape. But the greatest is love. Essentially, he's arguing that without love, faith is extraordinarily insignificant and cannot sustain a community in the image of Christ. Neither can hope. And so when you talk about love, the whole premise of Paul's ministry was to include in the economy of salvation Gentiles, the goyim, the dogs, the left out. And there was huge conflict around, could these people truly be grafted into God's promise that came through Abraham and Sarah? And what I tell people is that revolution is still ongoing. We still have the same fight. Will these people be included? Now in America, we do the cosmetic stuff. You got 2 or 3 white people in your congregation, 2 or 3 black people. You think all is fine. No, it's more than that. Are they fully included in God's economy of salvation? Paul says yes. And Paul suffers bodily harm, social harm, psychological and emotional harm for believing that God would include those that others would exclude. Same with Jesus. If you go to Jesus in Luke 4, he tells the people when he preaches, look, God looked out for a Syrian leper, and God took care of a widow who was not of our ethnic identity, of our theological identity, and they tried to kill Jesus.
Throw him off the cliff, right? Yeah.
Yes, they try to throw him off the cliff because he is saying that God has included those whom you would exclude. So let's deal with the fact that, and I'm going to say something here, y'all stay with me, that we are from a homicidal, murderous pedigree, that good religious people like us seek to kill those who would tell us that God includes all. And here's the challenge with the gospel. It is not just an inclusion that someone would come to your church, but it is an inclusion in the economic largesse of the nation, an inclusion in the nation's politics, and not just this nation, but globally. So now to how do you do it? You do it by being willing to give up something that is valuable to you. You do it by understanding if you are white in a culture that assumes whiteness as normative and universal, you must be willing to challenge that and surrender the comfort and the power that comes with that association. It means along the entire spectrum of human community, we've got to get locked in dancing with one another, sharing with one another in ways that are fundamentally anti-American, in ways that fundamentally brush up against our political culture. We've got to understand at base, Phil, and I'll stop here, how huge a chasm exists between our American culture and what the gospel is calling us to. Because the American culture is okay with things as they are, but the gospel is not. And so those of us who are in these communities, we've got to engage in the dance and understand that we are partners in the dance. God's Spirit is leader. And it takes time, it takes sacrifice, but it's entirely possible. And I'm very hopeful that we can do it.
This idea of the Trinity always made way more sense to me because I love to dance, right? Like this just makes a whole lot more sense to me. It's a 3-in-1 mentality, like it just warps the mind. But dance, I can get on board with that, right? This is where it's hard for me because as a white male, cisgender, like straight male, I come with a lot of status, a lot of privilege. And I can understand, I feel like, better this idea of kenosis and giving up and creating space for others because I hold that space. But, you talked earlier about like there are people who haven't been invited to the dance or are wounded outside the dance. Just like they become collateral damage of the imperial, like you said, or the empire, or whatever. And I think of your community, right? Like I'm not blaming, well, I won't put blame on anybody at this point, but I know that you're in the midst of a lawsuit with the Proud Boys right now because during the middle of some protests that took place in D.C., some riots that took place, like they damaged property on your building and tore down flags, and so again, I sit from a space of privilege to look at your congregation and say like, well, what does it look like for you to love the Proud Boys then? Like, that's a really tough question and one that I don't really want to ask, but I'm going to do it for the sake of the conversation.
No, Phil, so let me say this. Love often looks like holding persons accountable. So the challenge in marriage is when I have done something that does not help our marriage, my wife holds me accountable. That's not a good feeling, but it's love, and it brings me into deeper humanity and connects me with the divinity that exists within me as well. The way that we love the Proud Boys is also the way that I feel like we love the former president. You hold them accountable. You do not let people escape with harming other people, with destroying property, with destroying what capacity we have for human community. So for us, it is a gesture of love to hold the Proud Boys accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Part of the reason we have what we've had politically is, if you take a look, let's go all the way back to the Civil War. Interestingly enough, those who were the seditious traitors never really had to pay a price for being seditious traitors. Yeah. Matter of fact, later on, they were celebrated in the myth of the lost cause. Because they were never held accountable, they are still fighting a war that has been over in one sense for 150 years. And some people say the North may have won the war, but the South won the culture. They were never held accountable. People who are not held accountable become very dangerous to themselves and community. So the way that we will hold the Proud Boys accountable is we are going after them. And what we hope our lawsuit will do is to prove that they have had a conspiracy together across state lines, moving money to act in the interest of white supremacy. And we want nothing less than to shut them down.
Yeah.
And that's love.
That's a love that's accountable to them, but also a love that supports a whole lot more people too, right? Like it's a...
Yes. And the thing that I mentioned too, Phil, is that I will never dehumanize them the way that they dehumanize me. I would never go by their churches and say what we have recorded them saying, or We recorded them on camera with obscene gestures as they move by our church. We'll never dehumanize them, but we will protect ourselves and we will hold them accountable to the fullest extent of the law, because you don't grow, I don't grow, if we're not held accountable. And we have to be clear that the mythology that drove them to think it was okay to do what they did is a profoundly American mythology that I want to tie to our earlier conversation around who doesn't get to dance, right? And so this deeply American impulse that it is okay to exclude. It is okay to say that these votes are illegal because the people that cast them are not human beings whom you deem worthy of the divine dance. And so what communities like yours and mine can do is we can embody, teach, and show that the culture is never sufficient. The gospel is pushing us toward a broader, deeper dance of full inclusion. And that's what love looks like. And it's messy. I mean, you dance with people with whom you love, as do I. We step on toes, we get out of rhythm, we get out of sync, but you remain on the floor. I know, as one who was a wildflower growing up at the dances that I would attend in the 80s and 90s, there's a lot of pain to sit on the wall and see others on the floor.
Yeah.
There's so much more joy. It's not a zero-sum game. The floor is wide enough. The song is joyful enough for us all to participate.
Let's keep dancing.
Yes, sir.
Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. I can't tell you how grateful I am to just know you, but then also that you would take the time to come and join our community to be a part of this conversation.
Phil, I'm honored. And when I got a chance to get to know you, I said, whatever it is, this guy's got it. So you got it, man. Keep letting it flourish. And the community is gifted to have you. And I'll see you soon.
All right, Bill. Appreciate you. Blessings.
Thanks, Phil. God bless.
All right, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back for worship. See you in a couple minutes.